Daniel Webster was a New Hampshire farm boy and a brilliant orator who became the defender of the Union. Daniel Webster, one of America's greatest statesmen, was born in Salisbury, New Hampshire on January 18, 1782. He came from humble beginnings. He had a powerful presence and commanding voice. Webster's family struggled financially on their small frontier farm. He was a sickly child but showed exceptional intelligence from an early age. When he was 14, his father scraped together enough money to send him to Phillips Exeter Academy. Then in 1797, young Webster enrolled at Dartmouth College where he distinguished himself as a debater and scholar. The 19-year-old Webster graduated from Dartmouth and began teaching school to support his family, including helping to pay for his brother Ezekiel's education. Daniel Webster studied law and was admitted to the bar in 1805. He had a photographic memory that allowed him to recall entire documents word for word. In 1808, Webster opened a law practice in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Within 1 year, he married Grace Fletcher, a minister's daughter. Grace, along with his legal practice, established him as a rising figure in New Hampshire society. Webster was elected to the United States House of Representatives. He began to oppose the War of 1812, which he saw as harmful to New England's commercial interests. America felt that the war was destroying its economy and not giving it the prosperity that it deserved to chart its own course. Daniel Webster was not a wild-eyed radical or firebrand, any of the fervent extremists if you will who were shaping early American politics. He was a more cautious and calculating figure. In 1813, Webster took his seat in Congress. For 4 years, he served New Hampshire's interests, defending shipping and trade. Webster was literally the man with the golden tongue who stood before Congress ready to defend New England's economic future. In 1816, Webster left Congress and moved to Boston to expand his legal career. He relocated to Massachusetts where greater opportunities awaited him, but within years Webster was pulled back into national politics. Daniel Webster argued cases before the Supreme Court with unmatched skill. He won landmark case after landmark case. He always found a way to prevail with his masterful arguments. In 1819, Webster defended Dartmouth College before the Supreme Court. Daniel Webster was a legal giant when he argued the Dartmouth College case. He was using emotional appeals, logic, and constitutional reasoning to do it, and no one was expecting the passion he brought to the courtroom. Webster convinced the Supreme Court to protect private contracts from state interference. He won the Dartmouth case and McCulloch v. Maryland, but following those victories was a long climb to political prominence for the ambitious lawyer. Webster's legal triumphs established his reputation. His strategy was all about building credibility for the long term. Webster won another major Supreme Court case in 1824 with Gibbons v. Ogden, which expanded federal power over interstate commerce. In 1827, with his legal career flourishing, Webster returned to politics and was elected to the Senate representing Massachusetts. He agreed to serve in the Senate to help shape this growing nation. On January 26, 1830, Daniel Webster delivered his famous reply to Senator Robert Hayne. Webster was the only man who could match the Southern orators in eloquence and surpass them in constitutional knowledge. Webster defended the Union from the Senate floor in Washington, serving as one of the most powerful voices in American politics. Webster understood that for the nation to be really a unified nation and for there to be federal authority and not ruled by individual states, he had to defend the Constitution. He had to set the example of the statesman who put union above all else. Daniel Webster's second reply to Hayne became legendary in American oratory. The debate began over Western land policy but transformed into a fundamental argument about the nature of the American Union. Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina argued for states' rights and the doctrine of nullification, the idea that states could reject federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. Webster saw this as a direct threat to the survival of the nation. He spent days preparing his response, understanding that this moment would define his legacy and potentially the future of the country. When Webster rose to speak on January 26, the Senate gallery was packed with spectators. For hours, he spoke without notes, his deep voice filling the chamber. He systematically dismantled Hayne's arguments, asserting that the Constitution created a government of the people, not a compact among states. Webster argued that the federal government derived its power directly from the citizens, not from state legislatures. His most famous words rang out, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." These words would be memorized by school children for generations. Webster had positioned himself as the great defender of national unity at a time when sectional tensions threatened to tear the country apart. Webster's personal life during this period was marked by both success and tragedy. His wife Grace died in 1828, leaving him devastated. He had lost his closest companion and the mother of his children. Webster threw himself into his work, using politics and law as an escape from grief. In 1829, he remarried, taking Caroline Leroy as his second wife. Caroline was from a wealthy New York family and brought social connections that enhanced Webster's standing. But Webster's ambition was never fully satisfied by his Senate position alone. He wanted the presidency. Daniel Webster sought the nation's highest office multiple times but never achieved it. He ran for president in 1836 as one of several Whig candidates, hoping to deny Democrat Martin Van Buren an electoral majority and throw the election to the House of Representatives. Webster carried only his home state of Massachusetts. The defeat stung, but he remained a powerful force in the Senate. His speeches were published and read throughout the nation. People traveled great distances just to hear him speak. Webster's physical presence added to his mystique. He had a massive head, dark complexion, and blazing eyes that seemed to pierce through his audience. In 1840, the Whig Party nominated William Henry Harrison for president instead of Webster. Webster swallowed his disappointment and campaigned vigorously for Harrison. When Harrison won, he appointed Webster as Secretary of State. Webster finally had an executive position in the federal government. He took office in March 1841, ready to shape American foreign policy. But within 1 month, President Harrison died of pneumonia, and John Tyler became president. Tyler, a former Democrat, clashed with Whig Party leaders over banking and tariff policies. Most of Tyler's cabinet resigned in protest, but Webster remained. Daniel Webster stayed on as Secretary of State because he was negotiating the Webster-Ashburton Treaty with Great Britain. The treaty resolved boundary disputes between the United States and British Canada that had threatened to spark another war. Webster conducted quiet diplomacy, meeting secretly with British envoy Lord Ashburton. The two men developed a mutual respect and worked out compromises on the Maine Canada border, navigation rights, and the African slave trade. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty was ratified in 1842 and stands as one of Webster's greatest achievements. He had prevented a war and expanded American territory through negotiation rather than bloodshed. After completing the treaty, Webster resigned from the State Department in 1843 and returned to private life. He needed money desperately. Webster lived far beyond his means, entertaining lavishly and maintaining multiple properties. His legal fees and political contributions from wealthy supporters kept him afloat, but he was always in debt. Webster returned to his law practice and to his farm in Marshfield, Massachusetts, where he raised cattle and crops. He loved the land, the sea, and the simple pleasures of rural life, even as he remained consumed by political ambition. The question of slavery increasingly dominated American politics in the 1840s. The Mexican-American War had added vast new territories, and the nation debated whether slavery would expand into these lands. Webster opposed the expansion of slavery but also opposed the abolitionists whom he viewed as dangerous radicals threatening the Union. He walked a difficult middle path, trying to preserve both the Union and his political viability in the North. This balancing act would define and ultimately tarnish his final years. In 1844, Webster again sought the Whig presidential nomination but lost to Henry Clay. When Clay was defeated by Democrat James K. Polk, Webster returned to the Senate in 1845. He opposed the Mexican War, viewing it as an unjust conflict designed to expand slave territory. He spoke against the war but voted for supplies to support American troops. Webster's position satisfied no one completely. War supporters saw him as unpatriotic, while war opponents saw him as complicit. This was the pattern of Webster's later career, attempting to please multiple constituencies and ending up fully trusted by none. The Compromise of 1850 became Daniel Webster's most controversial legacy. The crisis began when California applied for statehood as a free state, threatening to upset the balance between slave and free states. Southern states threatened secession. The aging Henry Clay proposed a comprehensive compromise. California would enter as a free state, the slave trade would be abolished in Washington, D.C., but a stronger fugitive slave law would be enacted, and the territories of New Mexico and Utah would decide the slavery question for themselves through popular sovereignty. Daniel Webster faced the most important decision of his career. The North opposed the fugitive slave law, which would require Northerners to assist in capturing escaped slaves. Abolitionists viewed any compromise with slavery as a moral abomination. But Webster feared that without compromise, the Union would dissolve into civil war. He believed that preserving the Union was the highest moral and political good, worth almost any sacrifice. On March 7, 1850, Daniel Webster rose in the Senate to deliver what became known as his 7th of March speech. He began by saying he spoke not as a Massachusetts man, not as a Northern man, but as an American. He supported Clay's compromise, including the hated fugitive slave law. Webster argued that the Union must be preserved, that disunion would bring catastrophe to both North and South. He appealed to reason, to shared history, to the Constitution. His eloquence was as powerful as ever, but this time his words brought condemnation rather than praise. The reaction in the North was swift and brutal. Abolitionists denounced Webster as a traitor who had sold out freedom for political gain. The poet John Greenleaf Whittier wrote Ichabod, a bitter poem mourning Webster's fall, so fallen, so lost, the light withdrawn which once he wore. Ralph Waldo Emerson said Webster's speech was a disaster for his reputation. Former supporters turned against him. Webster had calculated that supporting compromise would make him a national statesman who saved the Union and perhaps finally win him the presidency. Instead, he became a villain in the North while gaining little trust in the South. The Compromise of 1850 passed, and the immediate crisis was averted. Webster believed he had saved the Union, and perhaps he had, at least temporarily. The Civil War was delayed by a decade, though whether this was worth the moral cost remains debated by historians. Webster's support for the fugitive slave law meant that escaped slaves living free in the North could be captured and returned to bondage. It meant that Northern citizens were legally required to participate in the slave system. For many, this was an unforgivable betrayal of human dignity and natural rights. In 1850, President Millard Fillmore appointed Webster as Secretary of State for a second time. Webster hoped this position would lead to the presidency in 1852, but his health was failing. He continued to work on foreign policy, dealing with issues in Central America, Cuba, and Asia. He negotiated with Japan, laying groundwork for the opening of that nation to American trade. But his energy was diminished, his body worn out by decades of stress, overwork, and heavy drinking. Webster made one final attempt at the presidency in 1852. The Whig Party convention met in Baltimore, and Webster hoped his service to the nation would finally be rewarded with the nomination. But the party was fracturing over slavery. Northern Whigs could not forgive Webster for the 7th of March speech. Southern Whigs did not fully trust him. The convention nominated General Winfield Scott instead, a military hero with no clear position on slavery. Webster was devastated. He had sacrificed his reputation in the North to save the Union, and the reward was rejection by his own party. Daniel Webster's final months were filled with bitterness and declining health. He returned to his beloved Marshfield, where he could look out at the Atlantic Ocean and tend his land. He suffered from cirrhosis of the liver, the result of years of alcohol consumption. He fell from his carriage and was seriously injured. His mind remained sharp, but his body was failing. He continued to receive visitors and discuss politics, still hoping he might somehow be called to serve his country one more time. On October 24, 1852, Daniel Webster died at Marshfield. His last words were reported as "I still live." He was 70 years old. The nation mourned the passing of one of its greatest orators and statesmen. Flags flew at half-mast. Eulogies praised his defense of the Constitution and the Union. But the controversy over his legacy had already begun. Had Webster been a hero who sacrificed his reputation to save the nation? Or had he been a moral coward who compromised with evil for political ambition? Webster's funeral was a grand affair, befitting a man who had served at the highest levels of government for decades. Thousands attended services in Marshfield and Boston. Political leaders from both parties offered tributes. But notably absent were many of the abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates who had once supported him. They could not forgive his support for the fugitive slave law. The split in public opinion about Webster reflected the split in the nation itself, a split that would explode into civil war less than a decade after his death. Daniel Webster left behind a complicated legacy. As an orator, he was unsurpassed in American history. His speeches were studied as models of rhetoric and logic. His Supreme Court arguments shaped constitutional law for generations. His defense of the Union in the reply to Hayne inspired those who fought to preserve the nation during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln admired Webster and drew on his arguments about the nature of the Union. Webster had articulated the principle that the United States was one nation, not a loose confederation of sovereign states. But Webster's compromises with slavery stained his reputation. He had argued that the Constitution protected slavery where it existed, even though he personally found the institution abhorrent. He had supported the fugitive slave law, which violated the conscience of millions in the North. He had prioritized union over freedom, stability over justice. Whether this was wise statesmanship or moral failure depends on one's perspective and on one's judgment about whether the Union could have been preserved without such compromises. Webster was also a deeply flawed man in his personal life. He was perpetually in debt despite a large income. He accepted money and gifts from wealthy supporters, raising questions about conflicts of interest. He drank heavily and entertained lavishly. He was vain and ambitious, constantly seeking the presidency that always eluded him. Yet he was also capable of great warmth, loyalty to friends, and genuine love for his country. Those who knew him personally often spoke of his generosity and his captivating conversation. The America that Daniel Webster served was a young nation still defining itself. The Constitution was a living document whose meaning was contested. The balance between federal and state power was unsettled. The question of slavery poisoned every political debate. Webster believed that the Union was the greatest achievement of the founding generation and that preserving it was worth almost any price. He feared that disunion would lead to endless wars between American states, to tyranny, to the failure of the democratic experiment that the world was watching. In the end, Webster's efforts to preserve the Union through compromise failed. The Civil War came in 1861, 9 years after his death. The Union he had fought to preserve was torn apart by the very issue he had tried to compromise away. Yet the Union survived the war and emerged stronger. The principles Webster had articulated, that the Constitution created one nation, that the federal government had supreme authority in its sphere, that the Union was perpetual, were vindicated on the battlefield and in the aftermath of the war. Daniel Webster never achieved his greatest ambition of becoming president, but he shaped the presidency and the nation in profound ways. His arguments before the Supreme Court expanded federal power and protected property rights. His diplomacy prevented wars and resolved disputes peacefully. His oratory inspired generations of Americans to love their country and defend its institutions. And his defense of the Union, however imperfect and morally compromised, helped establish the principle that the United States was one indivisible nation. When Daniel Webster died, he left behind a nation on the brink of catastrophe. The compromises he had supported were unraveling. The sectional tensions he had tried to calm were exploding into violence. The Union he had defended was about to face its greatest test. But he also left behind a tradition of American nationalism, of constitutional argument, of faith in democratic institutions. These would help carry the nation through the dark years ahead. Daniel Webster was even in death a symbol of the complexity and contradictions of antebellum America, a nation dedicated to liberty that tolerated slavery, a democracy that denied rights to millions, a union that was constantly threatening to dissolve. Webster embodied these contradictions in his own career, defending both freedom and compromise, both principle and pragmatism. His life and legacy remind us that history is not simple, that great figures are flawed, and that the choices leaders make in times of crisis have consequences that echo for generations.